There were a couple of state government by-elections held in Victoria over the weekend, and as seems to be tradition with these sorts of things, one of the first things people want to know is, what does it mean for the federal election? So, let's take a look. I guess first we need to tick off the usual caveats. So these were state seats, and what's happening in Victoria at the moment and the local issues there are not necessarily representative of the nation as a whole. So,
well, be that as it may.
First up, let's look at Prahran because I find it the more interesting of the two seats. Mostly because I found it entertaining to watch on as both Labor and Liberal supporters both seem to be celebrating the fact that the Greens have lost. Prahran had been held by the Greens since 2014. Prior to that, it was generally a Liberal-leaning seat that occasionally flirted with the Red team.
Oh, you.
The by-election in Prahran became necessary because at the end of 2024, Victorian Greens co-deputy leader Sam Hibbins stood down from the Greens and eventually quit Parliament altogether, following the admission of an affair with a staffer. Now, if Labor and Liberal supporters online are to be believed, the Greens lost thanks to any number of perceived sins, ranging from their stance on Gaza all the way through to Max existing. The reality is the Greens' primary vote in Prahran is essentially the same as it was in 2022. In 2022, the Greens received 36.4% of the first preference vote. In 2025, they've received 36.2%. As are pulling this together. While it is a drop of 0.2%, it remains significantly stronger than the Greens' historical average in Prahran. On that basis, any commentary suggesting that the by-election result is a stinging rebuke to the Greens is just not based in any reality. So if the Greens' first preference vote didn't fall away, what happened? Prahran was always going to come down to preferences. That's been the case since the Greens first snagged the seat. The reality here is that in this by-election, the Labor Party decided not to bother running a candidate in Prahran. It needs to be called out that in 2022, 83% of Labor preferences went to the Greens. Given Labor's popularity in Victoria is on a bit of a downward spiral at the moment, and given their previous performance in the seat, maybe they didn't view running a candidate here as being worth bang for buck. Or, as has been reported, Labor just chickened out of running for fear that if they performed poorly, it'd be seen as a referendum on the Allen government, something they didn't want to carry over to the 2026 election. So, into this Labor-created void stepped Tony Lupton, a former Labor MP who ran as an independent. Lupton was the Labor member for Prahran for 2 terms until he lost his seat to the Liberal Party in 2010. While not running as an official ALP candidate, it seems he had a fair bit of support from Labor-aligned people.
What do your old Labor colleagues think of you now doing this and preferencing the Liberals to hopefully together beat the Greens?
Well, I've got a whole lot of my former Labor MP colleagues helping me on the pre-poll booths, and they'll be out there also on Saturday helping me on the polling booths. I've got enormous support from Labor Party members, from Labor Party supporters.
I mean, he carried with him an endorsement from former Labor Premier Steve Bracks. His campaign manager was from Labor's Prahran branch. And I mean, if I had to speculate, I reckon Labor's decision not to run a candidate in Prahran this time around would have no doubt rankled a lot of the local branch members who would have then thrown their support behind Lupton as a result. For his part, Lupton's motivation seemed fairly clear.
The Labor Party hierarchy has got to get the message sent to it that the Liberal Party might be the Labor Party's opponents, but their enemy is the Greens. And that's the message that I think the Labor Party needs to understand. There's a great degree of feeling among the Labor supporters and the Labor membership that the Greens are effectively destroying the Labor Party.
So given that Labor didn't officially run a candidate, the fact that the Greens didn't get over the line here is perhaps not all that surprising. While the Greens might take some consolation in the fact that they maintained roughly the same primary vote as they did in 2022, they're probably a bit disappointed they didn't improve on their 2022 numbers. And there's potentially a few reasons for that. First up, right-wing lobby group Advance ran a fairly negative campaign in Prahran targeting the Greens. While its impact on the first preference vote likely didn't really reflect the dollar figure attached to the campaign, it wouldn't have helped the Greens cause. I'm guessing there'll be quite a few people eagerly awaiting what pops up in the disclosure log. And for what it's worth, The Age reported that Tony Lupton attended a campaign meeting with volunteers backed by Advance, so
stay classy.
Maybe there was some enemy of my enemy sort of stuff going on, who knows. Or maybe the reason why the voters of Prahran were being dragged back into the polls was still fresh in the mind of many. I can't see that having a massive impact on their primary vote, but again, I can't see that it would have helped their cause.
So what do you think happened? Why'd they lose?
The simplest explanation makes the most sense, and that is that neither the Greens, the Liberals or Labor receive enough of the first preference vote to get them over the line in Prahran, and whoever was going to take the seat was going to need to rely on preferences. Labor not officially running a candidate meant that preferences that perhaps would have traditionally flowed to the Greens went through to the Liberals instead. So while I reckon the Greens will be disappointed, I don't reckon they'll be mortified or humiliated. I reckon that Chip Legrand was so close here yet so far. It is reasonable to assume that Labor voters, having supported Labor before, hold basic Labor values. Therefore, it would make sense for them, in the absence of an official Labor candidate, to vote for the ex-Labor MP that had previously held the seat. It would make sense for those who hold traditional Labor values to park their vote with a guy spruiking his commitment to those values. The guy that, when writing to Labor members seeking their support for his campaign, wrote, "While I'm now an independent, you will all know that I'm true to those traditional Labor values that are so important." So I reckon for the most part, Chip, this is the guy that the Labor diehards will have parked their vote with, not the Greens. In case you hadn't noticed, Labor seem to hate the Greens more than they do the Liberal Party these days.
The Liberal Party might be the Labor Party's opponents, but their enemy is the Greens.
As much as there may be a few of the Labor diehards celebrating the Greens' defeat, I'm sure there'll be plenty of those within Victorian Labor regretting the decision not to run a candidate in Prahran, as Labor have essentially handed the seat over to the Liberal Party, which is not something they can really afford to do given the way the polls are currently tracking. It's going to be interesting to see if they decide to run a candidate at the next election or not. So now Werribee. This one, not quite as interesting. Lacked a bit of drama for me. Werribee has traditionally been a Labor seat. Tim Pellis, who to me has always looked a little bit like a doppelganger for character actor Pruitt Taylor Vince, held Werribee in one form or another for 20 or so years. And you'd have to think that if Labor in Victoria were travelling well, this one would be a slam dunk for them. On the flip side, if Labor are as on the nose with the electorate and the Liberal Party is seen as a viable alternative, it should be a slam dunk for them. But as of this second, Werribee hasn't been called and looks like it's going to go down to the wire, which is the most interesting thing to come out of Werribee for me. The fact that it's close points to the fact that neither major party is enjoying overwhelming support. In 2022, Labor received over 45% of the primary vote and the Liberals 25%. As of right now, neither Labor or the Libs look set to pass 30% of the primary vote. While the Liberals have seen a minor gain in primary vote, for the most part, the votes that Labor have lost this time around have been largely sprayed around minor parties and independents.
So, what did we learn?
And I guess this is what I'm taking away from the by-election in Victoria. While the major parties will pick up both seats, the results should still serve as a warning for them. Disappointed voters have plenty of places to park their vote these days. It doesn't have to be with a major. It also gets me thinking, with the way votes are flowing these days, is all the reporting on two-party preferred polling all that relevant? Probably not, but I'm not a polling expert or anything. When I look at the results in Prahran, I wonder if the Greens have peaked, but at the same time I wonder if, had it been a federal election, would Labor have vacated the field like their Victorian counterparts? Would they have stepped aside to let the Liberals in the door?
Probably not.
When I look at Werribee, to me it looks like, yeah, voters are less than impressed with Labor, but their feelings are not quite strong enough to see them shift their vote to the Liberal Party, proving that you can vent your frustration with Labor at the ballot box without letting this guy in the door.
It is possible.
Perhaps that's something to keep in mind.